Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
As recently as 1971, fewer than 5% of practicing lawyers and judges were women. That seems to me not very long ago. That seems to me amazingly recent. Today it's over 40%, and if you look across the world, in most countries, the majority of students in law faculties are now female. Same is true with academics, it's true with doctors and dentists, it's true with scientists. Almost the only holdout are engineers, and even there the number is rising. And so what you're getting is a world in which, the last time that the OECD did its calculations, half of what they call Class 1 jobs are held by women. And that is just historically, completely and totally unprecedented. It's something which, again, you know, if you read intelligent, educated women talking about life in 1910, 1930, 1950, this is not actually something they could conceive of. They were living in a world where women could get educated. They were living in a world where, compared to the Middle Ages, their opportunities were very real. But the sort of world that we take for granted today was something which even half a century ago people didn't believe was possible, and which is extraordinarily recent. And one of the things that I notice is how all male gatherings among professionals and people who are educated now look odd. One notices them. One goes, oh. But the point that I want to really underline is that what the OECD calls Class 1 is in most countries about 15% of the population, maybe up to 20%. It's a very small part. It's a lot of people, but proportionately, it's 1 in 5 at most, or 1 in 6. And this is the world that most women live in when they go to work. Most women work in jobs which are overwhelmingly female. These are the biggest 4 female occupations, and the red bit is the proportion of them that is male. So, you know, this is not the brain surgeons, it's not the bankers, it's the big jobs, the jobs that number in their millions. And I could also do a comparable slide that would be for men. Wouldn't be quite as extreme in most cases anymore, but it would be very similar. So although highly educated, successful, Class 1, graduates, whatever, people like us, I suspect, mostly in this room, live in an increasingly mixed world at work, a very large proportion of people don't. And a lot of women live in a world in which their work environment is overwhelmingly female. And that's a very, very major difference. Now, as I said, this is part of a change towards an integrated world at the top, with a world of people working, but working in much more traditional ways for the majority of the population. And what I want to say a little bit about today is how we got there, because a lot of the book is, in fact, about how we got there and not just where we are. But I think I'd also like to underline that the rest of the world is moving in this direction far faster than we ever did. That if you look at the developing world, it is changing at a very rapid rate towards these patterns, and doing so much faster than we did. This is female representation in the top 10 multinational companies in China and India, so developing countries of Asia. And as you can see, there are, you know, it's not half and half in the workforce, and it's nothing like half and half in the managerial or mid-level positions. But there is already, even though these are by our standards very poor countries, and you know, India is a country where it still has very, very high levels of illiteracy. China is a country which historically treated its women, one can only say abominably. I mean, they were sort of non-people. They didn't even necessarily have names quite often. And that's really quite recent, whereas today, half the self-made female billionaires in the world are Chinese. And already, in a country which has by Western standards, still very, very low levels of income. You've got about a fifth of the mid-level managers in India, and getting on for a third in China are female, and even at senior level, you're getting above 5%, getting above 10%. Now, if I put up on that chart the equivalent percentages for the USA or the UK in 1900, you wouldn't be able to see them. They would just be invisible. There would be maybe 1 or 2 unusual women in the whole country. So at comparable levels of income, US, UK, France, Germany, there were no women in comparable jobs. So this is a change that's going, I think, extraordinarily fast. And it is, as I said, not just because of economics. It would be perfectly possible for multinational companies in Asia and politics in Asia, where there are lots of extraordinarily successful female politicians, and indeed small companies in Asia, to operate in an all-male way, just as their predecessors in the West did. And they don't, partly because they can see it makes economic sense, but partly because I do think there has been a very profound shift in values and in the way that people think about women and the assumptions they make. And you can see that even in countries which are trying very hard to keep women in their place. For example, you've already got a situation in Iran where there are more female graduates than male. You find even people who are extremely traditional clerics getting up on any form of media and preaching about the importance of women behaving like women, and yet they will educate their daughters, and they will educate them properly. You know, one of the examples I give in the book, which I didn't dig out myself, somebody else gave me, is one of the most sort of fiery Al Jazeera preachers that there is, and he has 4 daughters, and they all have PhDs, and they all have science PhDs. So I think there is a profound change out there in the way that people think about women. But as I said, it's very much about the people at the top who are changing dramatically. For the rest of society, it's much, much less clear. What happened was that most women always worked for pay, and all women worked. It's not like they didn't work. But the general pattern for most people in society was that you worked for money, you were employed until you got married, and then you stopped working. And there was this moment in the sort of the mid-20th century when this changed, when it became normal for married women to work. And the other thing that was very interesting was that increasingly it became more normal for educated married women to work than it was for non-educated married women to work. What happened was that there was this sort of switch in mid-century. And again, one of the things which to us is almost inconceivable is that right through into the 60s and even the 70s in a few countries, there was a marriage bar. It was taken for granted that it was quite right that if a woman got married, she quit her job. And as that fell away, and that's what I mean about there being changing values as well as other things, it became more and more normal for married, educated women to stay in the workforce and over time to take less and less time out if they had children. And that, of course, makes an enormous difference, because what is actually happening now when you look at pay rates is that when women fall behind, it's because they're not following the same track as men. If you look for evidence that a woman in the same job doing the same, with the same track record is being paid less than a man, that basically has gone. I mean, essentially, equal pay for genuinely equal work is now the case. I mean, there are, you know, as I'm sure I'll be asked, aren't there cases of this, that, and the other at the top? But basically, that has gone. The problem is that many women, especially the other 4/5, find it very hard to maintain a work pattern. They get forced into part-time work, very, very insecure work. But from that mid-century on, what you actually get is an employment rate for married women that starts to go right up to almost male levels. And the other thing you get is you get education, formal education taking off. And formal education has been very, very good for women. Again, we live in a society where it's legitimate to hire people or not hire people on the basis of formal education. And, you know, once again, I do want to emphasize this is not just about faceless economic forces, it's also about changing values, that we consider it's legitimate to hire people on the basis of formal qualifications and legitimate not to hire them on the basis of formal qualifications. And that has been tremendously good for women. And again, this is a common pattern. I mean, these are UK figures, but I could show comparable figures for just about any Western country, and indeed increasingly for any developing country. The point came at which, instead of being a tiny minority who went to university, university numbers expand dramatically. They do this sort of upward catapult. And alongside that, you get female numbers growing, and again and again and again, you get this crossover point. For years and years, although the numbers of women going increase, they don't increase as fast as those of men, and then they get closer and closer, and they go across. And so almost every country, every developed country, and an increasing proportion of developing countries now have university systems in which women are the majority of students. And as I said, that has been very good for women in the modern system. The other thing that has happened is that childbearing patterns have diverged dramatically. And this is one reason why women do so well in the workforce at the top, and one reason why they don't do so well further down. But again, this is a major, major difference. Now, average family size has changed across the world and across society. You know, if you find a country where they still have lots and lots of children, you know that this is a really, really poor country in a serious mess. Because basically, family size has been plummeting around the globe. But it has fallen further, and it has fallen fastest at the top. And it's done so for men and women. And it's, again, these are Harvard and Radcliffe figures, because I haven't found anything that broke it out as nicely for men and women for British ones. But the overall pattern is the same. Basically, when you look at the elite, so this would be, you'd find the same pattern for sort of Oxbridge put together, or indeed for the University of London put together. I just can't find them for men and women like this. But this is from a fascinating longitudinal study of Harvard and Radcliffe graduates. Radcliffe was the female bit of Harvard, and then Harvard went co-ed, and it swallowed up Radcliffe, and Radcliffe basically doesn't exist anymore. But this is a study that looked at male and female graduates of Harvard and Radcliffe, and looked at how many children they had over time. And what is so interesting is that even as a group, they are way below replacement value. I mean, just way, way below replacement value. You know, 2.1 is what people normally think of as sort of replacement value for a society. Even the men who have slightly larger childbearing patterns, slightly higher childbearing patterns, are way below that. You know, 1.4 is the top that you reach with males in the 1980 cohort. So people at the top are having far fewer children. And that, again, goes for men and for women. And, of course, that also makes it much easier to make careers. I mean, some people don't have children at all. They follow careers. They may or may not mean to. But, you know, there are a lot of graduates, male and female, who don't have children. And those who do tend to have very small families. And that, again, is, you know, in terms of occupational success, that's a pretty good idea, because it means that, to put it bluntly, you don't interrupt your career for very long. It has all sorts of other repercussions. But again, it's one of the things that really separates the educated elites around the world from the rest of their society. They have fewer children. They interrupt work far, far less. They also have their children at completely different times. They have their children late. You know, most people who are holding what I've called sort of class 1 jobs, the top 15%, for them, increasingly, first children are age 30. But for other people, that isn't true. So you've got where people used to have their children at pretty much the same age, whatever class they belong to. You've now got this widening gap between people who have children in their 20s and people who don't have children until their 30s. And actually, if you look at people at the very bottom of the labour market, those who are actually living on benefits and who have very poor educational qualifications, they have them earliest of all. But I think that it's not just about penniless teenage mothers versus everybody else. That's actually not the way to look at it. It's actually 4/5 of society having children at what used to be thought of a perfectly sensible sort of age, and 1/5 of society who are not. And that's a profound change, and it's linked to lives in which, for a huge number of women, your job is a major part of your identity. That's what you're doing in your 20s. That's what you're actually concentrating on. And the result is these very different patterns. Before coming back to the people, the other 4/5, I just want to put up one more picture, which is, if you like, the downside of all this. The downside of it at the top is actually the big losers. The two big losers from this profound change have been schools, which used to mop up essentially the whole of really top female talent. You know, you start with the Brontes and you go on from there. So for sort of 100, 150 years, basically, intelligent, educated women became teachers. And that's no longer true. A very small proportion of them still do, but mostly they're off doing other things. The other huge loser has been charity. And you know, you tend to read stuff about, 80% of the population say they've done some volunteering. Well, when you actually start looking at the numbers, they look a great deal less impressive. So it's not that compared to generations before, when middle-class women gave huge amounts of time, I mean, just dramatically large amounts of time to work in the community, charity, that sort of stuff. That has just basically gone. And we tend to think, well, everybody makes up for it when they're retired. Well, on the basis of the data, no, they don't. You know, I don't think 6 minutes a day is a terribly large amount of time. You know, obviously there are exceptions. There are people who still do a huge amount, but these are the averages. So that's sort of modern elite life. It's basically a life in which, as somebody else said to me, you know, class trumps gender. Men and women in the top 5th, the top 6th, are increasingly like each other. They work together, they marry each other, they have children with each other. They do actually still marry, much more than anybody else too. They marry each other, they have children with each other. They don't have many children, lots of them don't have children at all. They don't do much volunteering, they're too busy. When they're parents, they go in for super intensive parenting. But the other 4/5, and I think this is the thing I really want to emphasize, in some ways it's a life that's modern in that people go out to work. But for most women, you go out to work in order to do the sorts of things that women used to do in their homes. You go out to work in order to look after people who are sick. You go out to work in order to look after children. You go out to work in order to provide services to those above you as a secretary or a low-level administrator. And actually, increasingly, you go out to work in order to prepare food that we're all buying ready prepared instead of cooking at home. So what you've got, and that's in a sense what I argue, basically you've got this dramatic parting of the ways between a top 5th or 6th who are a truly integrated group, even if there aren't yet as many women CEOs. Basically, men and women in the top 5th and 6th lead a genuinely integrated and historically absolutely unique life. The rest of society still lives in a much, much more traditional way. Their jobs are less secure. They often end up doing part-time work, you know, sort of tic-tac parenting, you know, I work this shift, you work that shift, pass over the children as you go in and out of the door. It's a much, much harsher life. And the book is, I hope, not desperately downbeat, because it's also about the fascinating things one finds out and the fact that for educated women, this is an amazing period of history. I mean, utterly amazing. And if you go back and read Jane Austen with modern eyes, rather than just burying yourself in the story, you can see that. But I do think we should be aware that for a large part of society, the things which have been fantastic for people like me have not necessarily been particularly fantastic. And inequality is not just about the 0.1%. It's actually goes quite a lot deeper and broader than that.
Every piece of research shows that education is the one transformer of society. Yes. Particularly for girls. I'm not saying that girls should be educated, boys should not be, but 33 million girls are denied the right to education, which boys in exactly the same position get. And they pay it forward, and they go into the workforce. But you also highlighted something very interesting internationally, which is that we now live in a multipolar world where the Anglo-American style of work is not necessarily where it's at. The emerging economies are where it's at in terms of female participation, but also just in terms of the demographic of the workforce. So you have a much higher flow from rural centres to urban centres, which are growing exponentially. I wanted you to say a little bit just more about the international view.
Well, I'm going to be a bit speculative here, actually, because it is, you know, that you should, there's, you know, the famous quote, you should never predict anything, especially not the future. But I think that they will be different because they are growing in a world which already recognises that women do have the same capacities as men in almost every respect. I actually, it's interesting. China fascinates me because it is, after all, a very large part of the developing world. At the moment, there are these amazing Chinese women who actually don't come from top families. They're not princelings. They come from nowhere and they build commercial companies. And I think that is actually a very real difference, because in many ways, a raw emerging economy of the sort that China is, with all its inequalities and pollution and corruption and all the rest of it, it offers people who come from nowhere opportunities which our very established education-based societies don't.
Well, it's very unique, though, because it is a successful and functional capitalist non-democracy.
Yes.
And one wishes that weren't.
One does wish
that wouldn't be functional,
true.
but it is functional.
But it's also growing. It's also an exploding economy. So it's sort of like it's like 19th century Manchester and Newcastle and 19th century New York. It's incredibly. Yes, it's not democratic, but it's just that the economy offers people who come from nowhere enormous opportunities. I actually also think the flip side you can also see coming out in China, which is that the top families consolidating their position. And again, the interesting thing is it's men and women. It's not just the sons. It's also the daughters. I do also think that talking about this sort of on the one hand, on the other. Yes, education is transformative, but education cannot mean that everybody can be a lawyer. At the end of the day, we are not creating societies in which all the jobs are great ones. We just aren't. And so I think that one reason I believe passionately in education is that there are going to be a lot of people who all their lives will do jobs for money, and the bits of their lives that are enjoyable and give meaning are going to be elsewhere. I mean, you can still quite enjoy working if the job's boring, if you get on with the people you work with. But for most people, a job is a way you eat. And that's not going to change however many people we send to university.